Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku had the summoning quirk, part 1. I don't own this fanfic, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, Lupine, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic, link is in the description. Let's begin the story. What would you do to become a sheep? How far would you go to not be an outcast? Izuku Midoriya found tears falling from his eyes as he sat in the hospital, though these weren't tears of pain, not at all. Perhaps disbelief and betrayal was closer to the mark, considering the reason he had ended up there to begin with. Izuku lived in a world where approximately 80% of the world population possessed some form of superpower, known as quirks. That 80%, however, varied by country and region. But China being the location of the first known quirk, it was no surprise that Asiatic countries had a far higher percentage of quirks, as compared to say America, where there were large areas without quirks, such as Amish communities. At 4 years old, when Izuku failed to manifest a quirk, no one thought much of it. While 4 was the common age that most gained their quirk, there were those who were born with them, and others that were several years older when they finally made themselves known. When literally every other kid in Izuku's year at school had gained their quirk and he hadn't, he convinced his mother to take him to the doctor, who claimed that he would never gain a quirk of his own, as evident by the joints in his toe. That had struck Izuku hard, and his mother too, as they had both broken down in shock. The young boy became withdrawn and reticent, even more so than the bookish child already was. As for his mother, when asked whether Izuku could become a hero despite his lack of quirk, she had soaked him in her tears while apologizing over and over again. News of Izuku's quirklessness somehow leaked out to the school, despite the boy himself never speaking of it to any of his classmates, and, as children often do at that age, they pointed and laughed. Children are honest creatures, if nothing else, having yet to develop the skills necessary to hide their thoughts, and in them can be seen the viciousness of the human condition. Izuku became a pariah very quickly, retreating away from others and becoming introverted and unsociable beyond what he had been before. His classmates' actions, on top of the doctor's words, rendering him without a speck of self-confidence to his name. At 6 years old, Izuku believed his fortunes to have changed, as something rather strange had happened. Upon the back of his hand could be seen 3 markings of an unknown design. Like a flower split into 3 sections radiating out from the center of the dorsal side of his left hand, it was actually quite beautiful. When he had shown it to his mother, she had rushed him to hospital. Not because she believed he had developed a quirk, no, but rather she thought her son had fallen so far as to self-harm and deluded himself into believing his quirkless state no longer existed. Izuku didn't realize this at first, thinking he was going to be checked out for whatever his quirk actually was. It wasn't until the doctor started gently questioning him about when the marks had appeared and what he'd been doing at the time did he comprehend what was going on. Understandably, having consulted his medical records, the doctor was skeptical of Izuku's belief that he had spontaneously developed a quirk, but examining the markings revealed that they weren't cut into his hand, nor were they burned there, and there was no damage to the tissue either. Even checking for coloring and dyes showed nothing wrong. It seemed that Izuku now had a patch of skin on the back of his hand that was naturally a vivid, eye-catching red. Believing that the original doctor who had declared him quirkless had made some sort of error, Izuku was checked over again. However, the results remained the same. He still had the toe joint, a blood test revealed a complete lack of genetic markers, a brain scan didn't reveal any development that would suggest a quirk existed, and even when a police investigator was asked to come in, his quirk allowing him to match residue against a person and verify whether their quirk was used in a location found him to be completely blank. At that point, doubt set in again. The mark was believed to be the result of a prank or something of a similar nature. Perhaps a child, cruel teenager, or a particularly unpleasant adult had seen fit to mark him with some sort of tattoo quirk or the like, as was sometimes used in the fashion and beauty industry to play with the young boy's mind and feelings. Having his hopes and dreams crushed a second time proved, if anything, even more devastating to Izuku. He began to withdraw even from his playmate Kitsuki Bakugo, who wasn't even much of a friend to begin with any longer. Every day seemed to drag on for the green-haired child until one day something rather unanticipated happened. Izuku packed his bags and left school, ignoring the audible mockery from his classmates, as well as the looks and pointed fingers. It was nothing new, and it wasn't like they were being physically abusive, only Kaken really did that, and only when he was in a foul mood. The day seemed to be a good day, as the blonde boy barely seemed to register the fact Izuku existed, much less made to torment him once again. Instead, he was surrounded by sycophants who praised his every action, and he basked in their attention. Leaving through the school gates, Izuku paused for a moment to consider what to do. His mom was working late today, and he didn't really want to go back home alone just yet. After a moment's thought, he headed towards the town center, like he usually did whenever he had time to kill. The crime rate in that area, and thus the chance to see a hero in action, was higher than where Izuku lived. Not that anywhere was really crime-free, especially not since the dawn of quirks, but there were certainly places where it was more common, and places where there were valuables to steal such as jewelers were more tempting targets to thieves. It didn't take Izuku long to get there, and once he did he idled around the area. A few of the local heroes were out and about on patrol, and Izuku contemplated getting an autograph or two from them, but there were rather large crowds around the easily visible pros. Eyes scanning the rooftops, Izuku soon found what he expected to see, an underground hero unless he was mistaken. He noticed that, when there was a group of limelight pros in a populated area, there tended to be one or two less visible heroes keeping an eye on things. For all Izuku knew, it was planned that way. With the bright and loud heroes taking the attention of the crowd and potentially tricking criminals into believing them distracted the heroes who wore more effective, less dazzling apparel, made sure that no crimes were committed in the meantime. Izuku jumped a little when one of the pros up high looked his way. He thought he saw them raise an eyebrow, but it was too far to be certain. What he did see was the hero give him a small wave before continuing to survey the area. Izuku's cheeks warmed at having been noticed like that, but a moment later he shook it off. Taking a seat on a nearby bollard, there being no free bench in sight, the young child took a notebook out of his school bag along with a pencil, making a start on some new hero analyses. He already had some rather extensive notes on all the local heroes that weren't underground, but he might notice something or get some sudden idea that he hadn't before. Also, if he sketched a hero on the roof, he might be able to work out who they were, not that there was any guarantee of that happening. Well, the government had a database of every official hero in the country, and all of them were required to carry their licenses with hero identity numbers you could verify by phone. Not all heroes had their information available to the public. Idle heroes, rescue heroes, and the large majority of combat heroes tended to have pretty much everything known online, including things like their real name, birthdays, and quite a bit of personal information, but most underground and investigation heroes tended to avoid such things. Something caught the edge of Izuku's eye, making him turn to the left slightly. Were criminals really that obvious? A hulking, 7-foot-tall mutant type was smashing the window of a phone shop. There was a jeweler literally 2 doors down. Why go for a phone shop? Wait, shouldn't smashing glass make a lot of noise? Izuku didn't hear anything. This guy looked like some sort of bodybuilder rhino with 4 arms, so that had to be his unless his appearance was an inherited trait rather than his own quirk, and he had some sort of aura of silence around himself instead. Izuku yelled for the pros to arrest this obvious criminal, but not even he could hear himself right now apparently. Thinking quickly, Izuku began waving his arms like mad, trying to get someone's attention, either one of the currently oblivious shoppers, or even better the hero on the rooftop. On said rooftop, the hero snapped his head in Izuku's direction, and when the green-haired boy pointed at the robbery in progress, he vanished from the rooftop. A few moments later, Izuku caught sight of the pro flitting between alleyways at a rapid rate, heading in his direction. Excited to see a hero in action, Izuku turned back to the thief, pencil, and notebook at the red. Izuku choked. Maybe making such a fuss to get attention hadn't been the best idea. The rooftop hero had obviously not been the only one to notice him, as Izuku now had 2 meaty arms, each thicker than his thigh wrapped around his neck. The fuck you think you're doing, little punk? The man growled lowly and menacingly. Izuku's only response was choking and gasping due to lack of air. Try something like that again, and I'll squeeze hard enough your fucking head will pop off, you got me? He spat, turning away from him. Izuku was about to sag in relief and catch a breath, the man having released him in order to flee the scene of his own crime, but almost immediately he tightened his grip on Izuku's throat, his face starting to turn red as he struggled for air. Fucking hero shithead. The villain snarled. You're going to fuck off quick or the kid is going to get it, you hear me? Eyes rolling in their sockets, Izuku finally got a closer look at the rooftop hero that he had been waving at. It was a woman, slender but lacking in curves, yet she looked rather well muscled from what he could tell. She had a blue-gray costume on, tight to her body, and a cloak of some sort of fabric over it. Izuku thinks he can see metallic threads woven into it, so it's probably meant to dampen any hit she takes. Put the kid down, and we won't need to get nasty. The woman spoke calmly, yet the rough and scratchy quality of her voice added an edge to it. There's more heroes here than just me, and any exit you had has already been cut off. Harming the kid now is only going to make things worse for you when we take you down. She was right, Izuku could see that the heroes he'd been looking at before were already on the move. This guy was screwed. A silent aura wouldn't help now, and while he seemed a lot stronger than a normal person, physical enhancement is one of the most common types of quirks there was, even as a side effect of another sort of quirk. The villain laughed. You're a fucking hero, your job is to protect people. So what if I make off with a few thousand yen worth of loot if the little punk here dies? That's blood on your hands, eh? Delay tactics only work when you have the time advantage. The hero shook her head. The others will be here long before that kid suffocates, and, as unpleasant as it is, he'll recover. Izuku agreed with that, being choked out wasn't nice at all, and he was feeling lightheaded now, but it wasn't painful. Then let's hurry this thing along then. The man yelled, getting attention from the crowd around them, the civilians only now really taking notice that something was happening. They murmured to themselves, as the villain took one of the two hands from around Izuku's neck and drew a gun, pointing it to the child's head. Never thought I'd actually need this thing. He shrugged. Picked it up for almost nothing a few years back, thought it'd be good for an emergency, a last resort thing. He grinned evilly. Lucky me, eh? Izuku froze solid, perspiration dripping from his face in horror. He had a gun to his head. You're not doing anything to help yourself here. The hero continued, voice remaining calm. Killing the kid solves nothing, we'll still take you down straight after, and then you'll have a murder charge on your head instead of just theft. Just put the gun down and let the kid go. Wave way. Izuku jumped as one of the pros, Death Arms, arrived on the scene. What's going on? The robbery turned hostage situation. Wave way, the name of the underground hero apparently, explained. Now shut up and let me talk this down from a murder. I'm here to back you up. Death Arm said, before apparently attempting to start a stare down with the bulky man currently choking Izuku. One more hero comes this way, I'm blowing the kid's head off. The villain growled, an edge of something in his voice that Izuku didn't quite catch. He felt the arm around his throat tighten a bit and could only assume the villain was getting tense now that he was outnumbered and Wave Way had said there was more than one hero on the way. Bet on that fucking communicator and send them away, do it. He yelled. Wave Way, visibly and slowly, reached for the communicator at her waist. She raised it to her face and spoke audibly into it. We have a hostage situation developing on. Wave Way began before being interrupted. I heard there's a robbery. A new pro called out, dropping down from above. Wow, big crowd. This new pro looked young, barely out of his teens. The air crackled with electricity as he floated in the air. Unfortunately, an errant spark jumped to the metal gun in the robber's hand, the electricity causing a finger to contract on the trigger, sending a bullet heading down the barrel. Izuku clamped his eyes shut, waiting for the end. Visible to the entire crowd, the red markings on Izuku's hand suddenly shined with brilliant crimson light. There was a bang, and more than one scream. Then there was shock. Izuku's first realization was that he was alive. The second was that he could breathe again. The third was that he was very sweaty now. That was only his fourth thought when his mind actually kicked into gear and he scrambled to his feet, having collapsed to the ground when the villain had let him go, except the villain hadn't let him go. No, he could see two arms on the ground in front him leaking blood. Slowly tilting his head backwards, Izuku took in the sight of the one who had saved his life. Then he blinked and had to take a second look. The robot girl with a tail and wings was not what he was expecting. She kicked the villain away from them, now down two of his forearms, and clipped the wing she held back onto her back. Given the blood on the edge of it, he was going to assume that was how she had dismembered the bad guy. This is most unexpected. She said, to be summoned at all is a surprise, but these people look too weird to be normal humans. She had obviously glanced around at the mutant types in the crowd before she looked down at Izuku, focusing on the marks on his hand. So you're my master. He couldn't tell whether that was a statement or a question. Very well then, this mecha is yours to command. Our contract shall last until you dishonor it. Mecha? Izuku mumbled, not quite sure what was going on. Kid, is this your quirk? Wave Way spoke up, making Izuku jump. Looking behind her, he could see that the villain had already been wrapped up in bandages to stop bleeding and was ready for transport. Quirk? Izuku blinked dumbly. Wah no, I'm quirkless. Wave Way looked unimpressed. Boy, we all saw those marks on your hand glow when she appeared. What is it? Some kind of teleportation quirk. Call things that you've marked. No. Izuku shook his head. I was diagnosed quirkless 4 years ago. We went back 2 years ago when these marks appeared, but still nothing. I was told it was probably someone playing a trick on me. Wave Way looked at the pink and steel gray machine. You're not going to turn violent on me, are you? She asked bluntly. Bring no harm to me and my master and I shan't retaliate. The robot replied. Good, then you wouldn't mind you and the kid coming down to the police station to answer some questions. Then this whole thing just got a lot more complicated. Wave Way sounded resigned at the end there, though she kept one eye pinned on the mecha at all times. Well, master, shall we go? The robot girl asked. Why yes, we should go with them. Izuku stuttered, not quite sure what was going on. In a daze he stepped around the severed limbs and reached out to the robot that had saved him. She allowed him to cling tightly to her as they began to follow after Wave Way who led them away from the crowd. The glance back saw Death Arms chewing out the even younger hero with a lightning quirk that had set all this off. They looked both embarrassed and pale, having realized just how close they'd come to causing Izuku's death. Sansa Tamakawa looked over the medical report he'd sent over. Just as the Midoriya boy had claimed, he had indeed been diagnosed as quirkless, twice in fact. The report made mention of the colored markings on his hand and the theories about where they had come from. It all matched up. Except that was for the killer robot calling the boy master. Well, that was a little unfair. The robot hadn't actually killed anyone, as far as he was aware, and while cutting off the man's arms had been extreme, it had served its purpose in saving the boy's life. Now if only the robot thing would give him an actual straight answer. The boy was fine, as much of a stuttering mess as he was. He told the officer everything he asked and didn't lie or try and hide anything, as far as he could tell. Nothing the robot said made any sense though. The facts, as he knew them, were as follows. First off, she was a machine. That wasn't up for debate. She was made of metal, had mechanical and electrical components in place of organs, and had programming in place of a brain. Not that she was any less a person for that, as she still held opinions and a personality of her own. 2. She wasn't so much a machine as a machine spirit. Whatever the hell that even meant, and no, he wasn't thinking about that old tabletop game his nephew liked to play with aliens and whatnot and machine spirit cultists or whatever. When she demonstrated her ability to enter spirit form and completely vanished from view, he'd nearly jumped out of his fur. Invisible and intangible, that was a powerful combination, one that didn't quite match up well with how physically dangerous she appeared to be. Anyway, the third thing he knew. As long as Midoriya respected her, she was willing to obey him for now. She was his servant, she said, and it was a servant's duty to follow their master. He could practically hear the capitals in her voice. Right now, Midoriya seemed to be looking at her with awe more than anything. Not surprising really, she'd saved his life, and the bloody reality of what she'd done hadn't sunk in yet. While healing quirks existed, it was another matter entirely to restore lost limbs. Hopefully, they could get them sewn back on or something. Sansa wasn't a doctor, he didn't actually know what could and couldn't be fixed. Villain or not, no one deserved to be down a few arms like that guy was. Midoriya, in light of the evidence we have in regards to your supposed lack of quirk. Sansa indicated the medical report. As well as Waveway's own accounting of the events earlier today, you will not be charged with public use of a quirk. As this was a clear case of self-defense, especially at the risk of your own life, you will also not be treated as a vigilante. The boy calmed down significantly there, his shaking subsiding as he leaned into the robot girl's side. However, I do recommend you make an immediate appointment to have your quirk tested for a third time. Sansa insisted. You will need to register your quirk within 6 weeks of this event, and knowing all you can about it and what it can do can only benefit you now and in the future. I will. Only a mild stutter from the boy, much better than earlier when he'd asked him about the events he was a part of. Good. Sansa gave him a smile. Now, your mother should arrive shortly. You can wait here for her, or you may wait by the reception, whichever you prefer. We will need to speak to her though, but don't worry, you are not in trouble. In fact, what you did was rather heroic. Just, if it ever happens again, please don't make yourself a target of the villain. I'll try not to. Izuku nodded. Sansa watched as the boy clung tighter to the robot girl, taking comfort in her presence. That's all I can ask. Sansa acknowledged. Now, I have some paperwork to do regarding this incident, so I'll be on my way, sir, don't worry. Izuku got up from the seat and bowed before leaving the room, the robot girl right behind him. Sansa sighed. This is just what Musatafu needs, robo-bodyguards. He looked over his notes again. Quite odd though, don't think I've ever heard of a pet type looking quite so human, or mechanical either. Izuku Midoriya collided with her son in the entrance of the police station, her eyes releasing a veritable biblical flood of tears as she checked him over. She'd heard the news about the boy being held at gunpoint, and the police call told her it was Izuku that was grabbed, so she'd been out of her mind with worry about her baby boy. It was only after she'd made absolutely sure that Izuku was in no way, shape or form actually physically hurt, though she'd be making katsudon for supper tonight, his favorite, when she turned to the robot girl he'd summoned somehow. Izuku was quirkless, they'd checked twice, and yet he'd still somehow used a power no ordinary person had. How did that happen? And why was his quirk the ability to summon a robot that looked like a teenage girl? If Hisashi had some sort of conjuration quirk, or a pet type maybe, then she could understand it better. Her quirk, attraction of small objects, combined with something like that might result in summoning a spirit of some sort, but her husband's quirk was breathing fire. He liked to use it to toast marshmallows, not something that would result in this. Thank you for saving my son. She cried at the robot, who seemed a little shocked at the sheer volume of tears coming from the woman and was edging backward slightly, as if afraid she would rust. He's my master, of course I would save him. She affirmed. Oh, but I don't actually know your name. Inko seemed to realize how rude she was being a moment later. Oh, I'm Inko Midoriya, Izuku's mother. You can call me Eli. The robot said. Eli? Eli-chan. Izuku then remembered her referring to herself as a mecha. Mecha Eli-chan. Eli seemed to twitch a bit at that before smiling a little. Somehow her metal skin was flexible enough to do so despite her torso seemingly made from large and solid sections of metal. Yeah, Mecha Eli-chan, that's me. Her voice was soft there, her gaze distant, as if lost in thought. The three of them headed to the Midoriya home after that, though Eli ended up walking there with Izuku, rather than in the car Inko had driven to the police station. Turned out that weighing in at 4 tons made Eli a bit too heavy to really work as a passenger. Luckily, when they got to the Midoriya apartment, she didn't fall through the floor, but she still stepped carefully throughout the small apartment. As Inko Midoriya went straight to the kitchen to begin cooking katsudon, Eli and Izuku went to the latter's room, where they sat in silence for a short while. Maybe we should get to know each other. Izuku began, his voice trailing off into the end. He gathered his courage though, and finally gave Eli a proper introduction. Hi, I'm Izuku Midoriya, I'm 8 years old, and I like heroes. He told her. I've always liked them, and it's been my dream for as long as I can remember to become one myself, to save people with a smile. I had a hard time keeping going for a while, because they said I was quirkless, and no one thinks a quirkless person can be a hero. Some people call me Deku, useless, but I want to prove them wrong. I want to prove that it's not the quirk that makes the person, but what they do with their lives instead. Eli raised one hand to her chest and replied in kind. My name is Mecha Eli-chan. I am based on the historical figure of Elizabeth Bathory. After several disasters befell Castle Ksejt, it awoke its final weapon. At my awakening, I attempted to replace the original Elizabeth Bathory and rule in her place as a servant of justice. However, I made several errors and was eventually shown the errors I made in the way I handled responsibility. I became a member of an organization known as Chaldea after that. I believe that you have somehow acquired a copy of my Saint Graph from that point in my existence. The Saint Graph? Izuku asked. Consider it the template to my soul and self. Eli explained. I am not the true and original Elizabeth, nor even the original Mecha Eli-chan, but a copy. I am nonetheless for it, but I don't have any of the memories or experiences after that point in my life. Seeing that she was confusing Izuku a bit, she explained a bit further. Consider us identical twins that were separated at that moment. She told him. I am my own person, and she is her own self. While we started the same, we will learn different things and become different people from now on. You want to learn? Izuku mumbled. Yes, this world is different from the one I know, and I would like to know about it. She agreed. How is it different? Izuku furrowed his brow. To start, humans did not openly possess powers or display them like some sort of fictional hero. Eli informed him. Izuku's eyes lit up then. You want to talk about quirks? Heroes? He asked excitedly, to which Eli agreed. It was a tentative start to what would one day be a very strong friendship. Thankfully, it was a rather simple matter to arrange another appointment with a quirk doctor, and the next morning saw Inko, her son, and his new robot companion head towards the local hospital. All three of them were on foot, Eli because she was too heavy for the car, Izuku to accompany Eli himself, and Inko because she thought she may as well join them, even if it was a bit of a long walk from their home. As they walked there, Inko couldn't help but look at her son. He seemed so much happier than he had been in years honestly. Hearing he was quirkless 4 years ago had crushed her son, and there had been little she could do about it. It was one thing if Izuku had come home with broken bones or bleeding wounds, but things had never gotten quite that bad. In today's world, bruising, scrapes, and cuts were just considered roughhousing, nothing to get concerned about, and this was Japan anyway. Unlike how places like America and Europe treated it, bullying was not considered a particularly serious issue. While the advent of quirks had shifted attitudes throughout the entire world, some cultural norms still existed in one form or another. In Japan, where conformity was valued, that had twisted into a strange sort of hierarchy, where strength and popularity ruled all. While not entirely accurate, it was still a generalization that stuck. Those who have power, connections, money, and good looks were given a lot more leeway than those less fortunate than them. Izuku had none of those going for him. He wasn't connected, he barely had friends to speak of. They were comfortable with their earnings. Hisashi earned a lot of money at his job overseas, and Inko worked part-time at the hospital herself, but they weren't rich or anything. Izuku could be considered rather plain, or even perhaps cute in a nerdy sort of way, but he wasn't classically handsome or striking. As for power, Inko would have said he actually had a disadvantage there. That was, of course, until he had apparently summoned a loyal robot bodyguard from somewhere, and that robot was definitely strong. When she'd asked about what Eli could do, she'd been told that she had a deadlift limit measured in tons, she had a sprint speed faster than most cars, and she was apparently capable of taking an excessive amount of damage before ceasing to function. With a robot that had the equivalent of a strength quirk by his side, Inko was feeling an amount of relief she'd never thought she ever would. Izuku would no longer need to come home battered and bruised, his school books missing or damaged, and she hoped he would keep his smile now. While she kept an eye out around them, Izuku had already suffered at the hands of a villain once already, and she wasn't going to let it happen again if she could help it. She focused most of her attention on her son and his new friend. Mecha Eli-chan, like Inko, was keeping a wary eye out on her surroundings. Finding out that any regular person in this world could have just about any power, super strength, shape-shifting, energy blasts, mind control, and more was somewhat disturbing to her. She was more used to a world where such powers were more rare and their wielders tended to be rather obvious and different to common folk. Well, she said she was more used to it, but in truth she hadn't exactly been active very long before she had ended up here in this boy's care. She had little experience of her own and was relying on second-hand information, so she couldn't be assured of its veracity. Still, things could be far worse. When Izuku had googled Castle Xedged at a request, she found its fate to have been the same as the one she knew, having been burned down in 1799. In fact, the known history of the world up until what had been the modern day matched what little historical knowledge she had. This world was seemingly identical to her own, with the only hiccup being the appearance of quirks in the mid-21st century, decades after she met the master of Chaldea. Still, while she could not rule over her lands now, she could serve her master well enough, a bright-eyed and optimistic child who wanted nothing more than to help people. Of course she would assist him in this endeavor, after all, what else was she to do? She had no purpose of her own and no real connection or loyalty to anything else here. She memorized everything that she saw, not that there was anything of particular interest. In fact, if it weren't for modifications to certain places and some of the advertisements she saw, both catering to those with abnormal body types, she could have mistaken her surroundings for the early 21st century, despite it being more than 200 years past that. Instead, what drew her attention were the people. She tried to puzzle out the quirks of those she could see. Some were rather simple, those being the mutants whose physical appearance had been altered in some way. The emitter types were harder, what gave them away was the way they subconsciously used their quirks. She'd seen it last night when something was out of Inko's reach, the woman not thinking twice before pulling it to her hand. Even now, unless her senses were fooling her, there were a few people nearby using some sort of thermal power to alter the temperature around themselves to whatever they found most comfortable. The woman with toddlers was keeping their attention focused with a simple light show, and a man with a dog was using some sort of either wind power or vector multiplier to throw a ball further than he should be capable of throwing it. Izuku and Inko had both mentioned that public quirk usage was illegal, but here was a significant portion of the population using theirs in everyday life, though aside from the woman with the little balls of light, they were all rather subtle, and no one seemed to think twice about it. She mentioned as such to Izuku, who averted his eyes and shrugged. They're not supposed to do it, but unless someone's making a big fuss, no one says anything. He told her. I mean, when Kaken blew up my desk the other day, the teacher just told him to calm down and went on with the lesson. Blew up your desk? Eli asked. Why would he do that? I'm assuming this Kaken is a classmate. Yeah, Kitsuki Bakugo, my best friend. Izuku told her. He's got a bit of a temper problem, but he's going to be an awesome hero one day. He's smart, strong, and his quirk is amazing. It's just I want to be a hero too, but no one thinks I can do it. I'm only quirkless after all. Is a quirk required to be a hero? Eli asked him. Well, yeah. Izuku hung his head. Villains have all sorts of quirks, how can someone powerless match up to something like that? What could I do to someone who could turn to stone or grow 50 feet tall? He shook off those thoughts and brightened up again. But I have you now, you'll help me be a hero, won't you? Of course. Eli agreed before looking the boy over. However, you're going to need to put some work in yourself. Izuku blinked in confusion before she explained. Servants are only strong as long as their master stays alive. She said, you're a target and fighting someone while keeping you safe will lower my combat effectiveness. I'm not expecting you to match me or even break any sort of record, but knowing you can at least avoid some idiot's clumsy flailing should make things easier. So should I start working out? He stuttered a little. Perhaps jogging? Eli mused. I don't know much about how humans exercise, but I remember something about stunting a child's growth. I'd recommend doing research before trying anything at least. I would assume the hero school you mentioned will likely have some sort of minimum requirement for fitness. Izuku was writing something in a notebook. Where did that even come from? She hadn't seen him grab one before they left home and was mumbling rapidly to himself. She listened in and heard him murmuring about how heroes like Endeavor were physically very fit despite having quirks that had nothing to do with being physically strong. It seemed he'd fallen into his own little world though, and Eli was a little put out how he had seemingly forgotten her. She would put up with it for now though. He was just a kid after all, not even in double digits left. The remainder of the walk to the hospital was done in relative silence, though not an uncomfortable one. Once at the hospital, Inko spoke to the receptionist about their appointment and they were immediately led off to the doctor, who it turned out was actually the one they'd seen 2 years ago when the marks on Izuku's hand had first appeared. "Well, little Mr. Midoriya, I can honestly say I never thought I'd see you here again," the doctor said, not unkindly. "I've been informed there was some sort of development, backed up with a report of some sort from the police, but I have not had a chance to look it over yet. Could you tell me what happened from your point of view? I was downtown yesterday. I wanted to see some heroes, sir," Izuku told the doctor. "I saw someone robbing a shop and got a pro's attention, but the villain noticed me too, An. Izuku's voice became choked off as he remembered what happened and tears began to stream down his face. He became pale and clammy, recalling the cold barrel of a gun pressing against his head. He remembered the abject fear and terror he had experienced at the time. He jumped in surprise as a cold metal arm was placed across his shoulders. Mecha Eli-chan had knelt down next to him and pulled him into a hug. Her massive metal tail and one of her wings were curled protectively behind him, granting him the courage to speak. "The villain took me hostage and started choking me before things got worse, and he put a gun to my head." He took a deep shuddering breath, rubbing at his own throat in remembrance. "Things got worse, but just when he pulled the trigger, Eli appeared and saved me." Eli continued on from there. "The report should tell you that the command seals on his hand glowed brightly before he summoned me. My first action then was to ensure the safety of my master, so I removed the threat to his life by removing the criminal's limbs." "I see." The doctor mused to himself before addressing something Eli had said. "You call the marks on Midoriya's hands command seals, do you know anything about their function?" "As I understand it, they can be considered a stored burst of energy," she informed him. "This energy can be used for several things, such as repairing me, charging my attacks, or even restoring me from fatal damage if all three are used. They may have other uses, but I don't know them. The only other fact about them I am aware of is that they are a symbolic representation of the connection my master shares with me as his servant." "So you are certain that Midoriya here is your master?" the doctor questioned her. "Yes, I can feel our connection," she confirmed. Good. The doctor nodded, noting something down on a form sat on his desk. "That matches up with most other secondary entities, or pet quirks, as they are called. Sapient quirks can always tell who their origin is, even in cases where they do not actually like their masters." The doctor asked a few more questions and put Eli through several tests. Things such as whether she could disobey Midoriya's instructions, whether she heard his mental commands, the distance she could go from him, and whether her stamina was derived from his. The only one that actually turned out to be true was the last one, but even that was a rather small drain. The vigorous exercise that Eli did had essentially no effect on Izuku, but when she began to unleash her armaments on a prepared target, Izuku did begin to feel only a slightly bit drained. Apparently his stamina went into replenishing her ammo reserves for her bullets, and missiles at least, and the energy reserves for her lasers too. Then came the interesting parts. When they tried to scan Eli with a materials analyzer, apparently it was used for transformation and mutant types with inorganic parts to their bodies, like the turbo hero Ingenium and his engines. The results were weird. It registered Eli as being made primarily of iron, not steel like Izuku had first thought, but it was stronger than iron should be, with no apparent cause that could be identified. Her weight also didn't match up to her volume. If the average human was composed of iron, then they would weigh approximately half a ton. Eli weighed 8 times that, and while her tail and wings added volume, it wasn't equivalent to 7 people. With Eli's permission, they attempted a pressure test to see how much force it would take to damage her, and at the machine's highest setting, she barely had a dent in her. A dent which restored itself over the course of the next quarter hour and left Izuku just the slightest bit more drained. Once that was over with, and with the correlation between Izuku's stamina being drained when Eli had to repair herself or restore expended ammunition, they attempted to scan for the energy signature they were sure was being used, one that in theory should conclusively prove the link between the two. Except they found nothing. But some sort of high-tech scanner attached to Izuku, they actually managed to gain some numerical data that showed a clear and linear pattern between the amount of ammunition Eli used and the stamina he lost, but they still did not find any form of energy being transferred between the two of them. "Well, Mr. Midoriya, I think we have enough evidence to prove the existence of a quirk, in spite of the lack of biological and genetic markers associated with such," the doctor eventually concluded before turning to Inko, who had spent the entire time sitting there watching everything. "There's one last thing I'd like to check, with your permission, ma'am." "What would that be, doctor?" she asked. "I have some tablets here for small children who have trouble controlling their quirk," the doctor said, pulling a few pill bottles out of a drawer. These ones temporarily suppress the quirk completely, but these ones on the other hand only reduce a quirk instead. The latter are used to help some kids learn to properly control their quirk. He grabbed the second bottle and held it out to Izuku. Your son lacks all of the physiological elements that would suggest he has a quirk, and this final test would determine whether items such as quirk suppressants work on him at all, and the same goes for quirks that affect other quirks, such as suppression, enhancement, and copy types. Inko looked at Izuku, who looked back, and both of them looked at Eli. If my son and Eli are alright with it, then I'll give my permission. Inko eventually agreed. Eli-chan? Izuku asked. The robot agreed after a moment's thought. Better to know now than when we're in trouble, and so long, as it's just reduction pills rather than complete suppression. Very well then, eat this. The doctor said, but just one. Izuku reached out and took a single blue pill, glancing at it warily before popping it in his mouth and swallowing it down. He was surprised that it didn't taste nasty at all, but these were for children, they were probably made nice to make them more likely to actually take them. He waited a moment before looking at Eli, who shrugged herself. Neither of them felt any different. They stayed that way for 10 minutes, then the doctor asked Eli to repeat some of the earlier tests to see if there was any difference, either in her effectiveness or in how much stamina Izuku lost. In short, there was no difference. As I thought. The doctor nodded. I don't know how your quirk functions, as according to centuries of research it really shouldn't even exist at all, but you are effectively quirkless, as far as being the target of another quirk counts. He typed several things into his computer before printing several sheets out. Here, this should suffice for registering your quirk, all it lacks is a name. The doctor handed the paper over. Also, here are my own contact details. I have one last theory regarding your quirk, but no means of testing it. What's your theory, doctor? Izuku asked, looking at all the technical words on the printout that he didn't understand. Well, I have two, though they tie in together. The doctor said, first, due to the long time since you were supposed to manifest a quirk, and those markings on your hand appearing, and even the time between their appearance and the summoning of Eli here, it's possible that your quirk required some sort of trigger in order to awaken. He tapped his finger in thought for a moment before continuing. It is rare, but there is a phenomenon known as quirk awakening, which can cause someone's quirk to evolve very rapidly, sometimes instantaneously. These are usually high-stress situations, such as the one young Izuku found himself in. It may be that such a situation was required for his quirk to manifest at all, or it is possible that it previously had an application so minor as to be completely missed beforehand. And the other theory? Inko asked, looking over the quirk forms and understanding a lot more of it than her 8-year-old son did. It's also possible that summoning Eli required a great amount of power and that his quirk has been storing it over a long period of time. So it could be that your quirk is an accumulation type rather than just an emitter, and the young lass did say that those command seals could be used as a burst of energy. The doctor explained. This also means that, if another threshold is reached, it's possible that you may summon another to your side, or even more than that perhaps. It's been 2 years since Izuku gained those tattoos on his hand. Inko said. You mean in another 2 years Izuku could get another one? Or less? Izuku suggested, grinning with bright eyes. I'm older now, maybe I make more of this energy as I get older. The doctor nodded. That is a possibility. It's also possible that another summoning might require a similarly stressful trigger to occur. Or, with sufficient practice, perhaps your son might be able to trigger it himself. He shook his head. This is all theory regardless, we don't seem to be able to detect the energy that this quirk uses, so we have no way of knowing where it is going, where or if it is being stored, or how much of it there is. If something does happen, you can contact me directly for any assistance you may need. Oh, thank you so much. Inko expressed her appreciation for the man. No problem, madam, just figure out a name for that quirk and get it registered. The doctor suggested. Thank you, doctor. Izuku waved as he, Inko, and Eli left the room. You're welcome, kid. The doctor smiled as he bid farewell to the small boy. He always did like it when his patients left with a smile on their face. Eli, did you know any servants like yourself? Izuku asked on the way home. Like from that Chaldea place you talked about? I don't know much. Eli said. I was only active for a very short period of time before I came here, but I believe there were several hundred servants there. Hundreds? Inko exclaimed, imagining trying to fit even half a dozen copies of Eli in her home with herself and Izuku. Yes, though Chaldea was a rather large facility, as I heard it. The mecha confirmed. I can give you several names, though pretty much any historical or mythological person can be a servant, along with a few odd additions like myself. You mean like Emperor Jimmu, Mamadoro, Kagayahime, and Kintaro? Izuku asked, eyes wide. I don't know about those 4 in particular, but I can confirm that Chaldea did have the likes of Sakata Kintoki, Minamoto no Raikou, and Tamamo no Mei as servants to name 3. Eli told them, before listing off a few others she actually knew of that were there. Some of those don't sound right. Inko murmured with a furrowed brow, hearing King Arthur and Jack the Ripper mentioned alongside one another. I thought Jaldia was supposed to be some hero organization, wasn't it? It fought to prevent the incineration of humanity, yes. Eli confirmed. However, they needed a lot of help and it was too hazardous to turn anyone away, as I understand it. I don't think Jaldia had to deal with anything worse than mischief or arguments, but I cannot say for certain. Oh, okay. Inko didn't know what to say to that. Hopefully Izuku never summoned anyone like that, if he summoned anyone else at all. Have you thought of a name for your quirk yet, Izuku? I think so. He said. Eli did say that servants were copies of heroes, right, and she's a spirit, isn't she? So I was thinking I could call my quirk heroic spirit, or is that a bad thing? Putting hero in the name he trailed off with his mumbling. Inko burst into tears, but hugged her son close. Oh, it's a wonderful idea, and I'm sure you'll make a great hero, Izuku. She cried. I'm sorry for being such a bad mother, I should have said it so long ago, I'm so sorry Izuku. She wailed. It's okay, Mom, things are better now. Izuku hugged his mother back. Mecha Eli-chan just stood to the side awkwardly. This was too much emotion for her. She wasn't MK. Too, but this was something else. She also wondered if Izuku and his mother actually shared some sort of tear duct geyser quirk, or if this sort of thing was normal here. She could swear that the two had cracked the pavement with the force of their tears. The next day, Izuku was back at school. He'd missed a day for the hospital and was going to get his quirk registered, and by the time both of those things had been done, it had been too late to be worth going to school, and his mother had to go to work. She'd swapped shifts with another nurse and would be working late afternoon and into the evening instead of the morning shift. That left Izuku and Eli home alone. They'd gone on the internet together and started planning a workout routine of some sort, basic though it might be. According to the internet, jogging like Eli had suggested was actually a good endurance exercise, but they also added cycling and swimming to the list. While they wouldn't be doing any heavy lifting or anything, apparently kids, as young as 7 or 8, could do 2 or 3 dozen repetitions with light weights without problems, so they put that on the list of things to look into. Sit-ups, push-ups, and stretches seemed fine though. They would have to wait and talk to Inko about potentially adding dance or martial arts classes to the list. She would have final say after all, though that didn't stop Izuku searching for and reading up on different styles of fighting in preparation. Now Izuku was actually almost skipping school, riding the high of finally getting his quirk, even if it was really weird according to the doctor. It didn't hurt that Mecha Eli-chan was walking beside him, physically at that. She would turn astral while Izuku was in class, so as not to disturb the lessons. That was fine with Izuku, though he did worry that Eli would get bored just standing around doing nothing for 7 hours. She assured him she would be fine, she'd never gone to school, so she shouldn't be any more bored than he was, and she was in fact looking forward to the history lessons if nothing else, if only to find out what happened in the last few centuries. Everyone noticed how happy Izuku was when he practically bounced into the classroom. He'd already been to the office to update them about his quirk, so the teacher merely shook his head and sighed. He really didn't need to deal with this shit today, and he was absolutely certain someone was going to blow their top, probably literally at that. Damn kids. Luckily the bell went shortly after Midoriya got to his seat. He tried to see if he could tell where the fucking scary robot dragon girl was as the headmaster had muttered, but he saw nothing at all. If he hadn't been informed about the change, he would have assumed the boy was as quirkless as he was last week and would have been as confused as his students were at the change in attitude. He began the lesson, as he usually did, but as he turned back to the class he saw a scrunched up paper bowl bounce off Midoriya's desk, having missed the boy himself. Deciding to hopefully cut things off before they got out of hand, he called out the boy that threw it. Suda, pick that up and put it in the bin. Don't let me catch you throwing another. He said. The boy, Kitsuro Suda, looked startled that he'd called him out, but nevertheless did, as he was told. Obviously too caught out by the fact he'd been reprimanded. Normally, he wouldn't have said anything, children would be children, and throwing paper balls was harmless enough. It wasn't like he'd blamed Midoriya for it, nor had he made the green-haired boy clean it up. Only this time there was an invisible robot armed with bullets, missiles, lasers, and even some sort of sonic scream standing right there. He'd been told that it was calm and reasonable enough, but he didn't want to risk it if he could help it. Let the machine go berserk in someone else's class, thank you very much. The lesson after that was a strange mix of calm and tense. The former due to him calling out things he wouldn't before, making the pupils hesitant to try and pull anything with him right there. Tense for exactly the same reason, wondering what had changed to make him act that way. When it was time for morning break, he let out a silent sigh, watching as Midoriya left the classroom. Right, that was it for him today, anything beyond this point wasn't his fault or responsibility. Itsuki was confused. Something was up with Deku. Anyone with eyes and 2 brain cells to rub together could tell, which means the extras had only taken half an hour to notice. Teach calling out Suda like that made even the idiots realize something was different now. Deku was happy. It felt weird to think that Kitsuki didn't think he'd actually seen Deku look like that since they were really little. In fact, he could barely remember it himself. It had been years ago. That was weird in that he hadn't actually noticed anything was wrong with Deku, beyond the obvious of his quirkless ass, thinking he could be a hero when he was so weak. Kitsuki didn't know what was going on, and he didn't like it. So he went looking for answers. Morning break went by quickly. He hadn't bothered tracking down Deku then. It wasn't like the useless little shit could get away from him, so it wasn't exactly a priority or anything. Not like Deku actually mattered or was worth anything. At lunch, one of the extras talked about something that had happened 2 days ago. Apparently a villain had taken a kid hostage and put a gun to his head. It was barely more than a rumor because there weren't really any pictures of it online or anything, but someone said they'd seen a new hero there and they'd been brutal. The shiny metal woman who had ripped the villain's limbs off and beaten him bloody with them. Like that was actually real or anything, a hero did that and they'd be fucked. Heck, a vigilante did that and there'd be a news special warning people about them, doubly so if a villain did something like what the rumors were saying. After lunch, Deku was still as cheerful as before. No, if anything he was even more cheerful. What the fuck did the nerd want to hear in history of all things? Maths had always been what the nerd was good at, that and science physics specifically. Now he hung off the teachers every word as they quickly recounted the history of quirks before focusing on the upheaval in China right at the start of the whole thing with the glowing baby. He talked about the riots, the religious response, and then the absolutely rapid rate at which it spread. The teacher concluded the lesson with a well-known theory that the trigger to quirks was a virus carried by mice, as it only took 80 years before more than 50% of the babies born around the world had started developing powers, much too fast for it to be inherited genetically from such a small original population. Kitsuki saw Deku pack his bags and hurry out of the room, but Kitsuki was faster about it and was waiting for him outside in the school courtyard. Seeing the boy coming out the doors, he released a large explosion in his direction to get his attention. Deku, the hell you think you're doing? Kitsuki trailed off as the excess smoke from his explosion cleared away to reveal a shiny, metallic surface in front of him that had taken the blast in place of Deku. Hey Kakin. Deku called out, his smile still as bright as earlier. I finally got my quirk. I can summon things to me, but not like my mom, no, actual people or spirits or something. I'm still not 100% sure what she is, but I summoned Eli-chan here, and Deku, shut the fuck up. Kitsuki yelled at him. What the fuck do you mean got a quirk? You're a fucking Deku. You don't have a quirk, they checked twice, remember, idiot. But Kachin, Izuku started, but was interrupted right away. But nothing. Kitsuki growled at him. I don't care why you made yourself a toy girlfriend, finally realized you're not going to get one yourself or something. He spat. I don't care what kinda creepy shit you get up to, just stay out of my way. He turned and stomped off, infuriated that his explosion hadn't even marked that fucking thing's metal wing. Izuku mumbled, looking depressed. I don't think I like him. Eli stated. If that's your idea of a friend, I believe you may need new ones. Even Wu Zishan, Carmilla and Cleopatra got along better than what I just saw. Let's just go home, Eli. Izuku sighed, his good mood already dropping. Very well. Mecha Eli-chan agreed. However, especially with him being Izuku's classmate, she seriously doubted this was the last time she'd have to deal with that foul-mouthed blonde boy. When they arrived home and Izuku went straight to his room, Eli decided to ask Inko a few questions about this Kakin kid that had gotten in the way and verbally and physically assaulted Izuku. First off, she asked whether Inko recognized the name. Kakin? Inko blinked. Yes, I know who that is, that's Izuku's best friend, Kitsuki Bakugo. Those two have been friends basically since Izuku was born. He hasn't been around here in a while though, not for years now that I think about it. She furrowed her brow, thinking back to how long it had actually been since Kitsuki had been around to visit. He prevented Izuku from returning home and unleashed some form of explosive on him. Eli told her. He then yelled at Izuku, sweating profusely and denying he had a quirk at all, before storming off in anger. What? Inko exclaimed. Kitsuki's quirk is an explosion, but why would he use that on Izuku? They're friends. They've been friends for forever. Izuku did act that way, but I saw exactly no other child in the school treat him well. Eli said. At best they ignored him, like he wasn't there, but there was an unexpected number that mocked him when he was nearby. Aside from one boy that threw a paper ball at him, Kitsuki was the only one to get physical with him. Inko took a while to get over her shock. That can't be right. Mitsuki has a foul mouth, but she wouldn't let Kitsuki bully anyone. He wants to be a hero, he should know things like that are wrong. His mother might not know any more than you do. Eli suggested. The boy did not act like I would expect a hero to act either, using the definitions that Izuku has given me at least. She conceded, as the term hero could be a lot looser for those she'd known before. I think I need to talk to Mitsuki about this. Inko said. Eli just nodded before wandering off to join Izuku in his room. She found the boy with his nose in a notebook. Looking over his shoulder, she saw a surprisingly decent sketch of herself with a list of her physical capabilities, comments of his own sprinkled amongst it all. She tapped him on the shoulder, making him jump. You should do one of those for yourself. She told him. I meddle, there's nothing I can really do to get stronger or faster. You're alive, and you're rather scrawny. Like I said before, you're the weak point in our partnership. If you die, I will disappear. Izuku slumped in on himself. I know that. He said, his voice almost too low to hear. What can I do though? I mean, without you, I'm basically quirkless. What can a quirkless person actually do? Eli huffed. Are you upset by what that blonde brat said earlier? She asked. Ignore him, and if he decides to attack you again, I'll show you just how far I can launch him. I'm sure I can reach the sea from here, it's not too far away. You can't do that. Izuku gasped. Kaken is really strong, but water dilutes his sweat. He can't use his quirk like that. If you threw him too far he might die before he could get back to shore. So if you dumped enough water over him, he'd basically be quirkless then? Eli asked, a small smirk on her face. Sounds like a big weakness. What's he going to do when it rains if he makes it, as a hero? Not doing his job. Izuku shook his head. No, Kaken is really smart. He'd probably have a hero costume with, like, water balloons or something that he could store his quirk in, and use that instead. So grenades then. Eli said. And how many heroes have some sort of power that can be reproduced with technology? Wasn't there a hero you talked about that could toss fire about? How's that different from a flamethrower? I think Endeavor's a bit better than a flamethrower. Izuku mumbled, but he still understood her point. With the right equipment and skills, it might be possible for a quirkless person to match up to someone with a quirk. It would be a lot harder, and they'd be limited by what they could carry or wear, but it might be possible. That small hope planted a seed in Izuku's mind, and bolstered by Eli's encouragement, he flipped over a page in his notebook and reached for his laptop. First thing first, find as many heroes with minor or less powerful quirks and see how they fought. He knew who he was going to start with as well. Manderley of the Wild Pussycats, quirk. Telepath. Itsuki Bakugo had a scowl on her face as she got off the phone with her longtime friend Izuku Midoriya. What she'd been told had been a surprise, and not a pleasant one either. It seemed her son needed discipline. She kicked the door to her son's room open and yelled at him from the doorway. Boy, brat, did something happen with Izuku today at school? She asked, about as polite as she ever was, at least in the privacy of her own home. Fuck off, hag, he's fucking fine. Kitsuki yelled right back. Got some sort of robot toy now, but who the fuck cares about that? A robot summoned by his quirk, I heard, yeah. Mitsuki said. One that had a few things to say about you today. Want to explain that? He doesn't have a fucking quirk. It's just some sort of robot, fucking anyone can build one. Kitsuki scowled. Idiot's not completely fucking stupid, he could do it if he really wanted to. That was probably as close to a compliment as he was going to give Deku. He might not have a quirk, but he was smart. Now if only he realized he couldn't be a hero with how weak and powerless he was. The robot is his quirk. Mitsuki said. He summoned it when a villain had a gun to his head. Inko says the doctor thinks it was stress that caused his quirk to start working. Wait, it really is a fucking quirk? Kitsuki asked. He had thought that Deku had been lying about that. The idiot thought some fancy tattoo on the back of his hand had been his quirk 2 years ago. Fucking idiot had probably broken down in his head, made himself delusional. Yes, it's a quirk. Mitsuki confirmed, that's what Inko had said at least. Now what's this I hear about you trying to blow Izuku up with your quirk? I was just getting his attention. Kitsuki said. He almost ran right past me. And you thought the best thing to do was to explode him? Mitsuki asked. Fucking hell, Kitsuki, learn some goddamn sense will you? I'm not stupid, hag. Fuck all else would make him actually look. Kitsuki yelled back. The two bickered back and forth, the mother believing this was the end of things. She would be wrong. Back at the Midoriya residence, Izuku was quite surprised at how long his list had turned out, and there were some big names on there too. Manderley had been one of them, but so had her teammate Ragdoll. Then there was Sir Night-Eye, All Might's sidekick and power loader, and even Nezu, a pro hero who was actually an animal with a quirk. His quirk gave him super intelligence, according to his official hero page, that was it. He wasn't fast, strong, or anything like that. Finding footage of any fight with him and it was difficult, but it wasn't non-existent. Nezu worked more with cyber criminals and analytics than anything else, but almost every hero had been in a fight at least once, even idle heroes. Nezu almost didn't look like he was fighting in the videos he managed to pull up. He mocked and insulted the villains who bumbled into one trap after another, becoming infuriated with the small pro before they exhausted themselves, and Nezu was able to knock them out easily. Our loader was another interesting one, as his hero page listed out several of his qualifications, including a number of engineering and design degrees. Unfortunately, our loader did a lot of his fighting below ground, using his fingers to rapidly dig through the earth like a mole, so that was less helpful to him. This proves my point, doesn't it? Eli said. Not all heroes have physical superiority over their foes, and even those stronger or tougher than normal can still face villains even stronger than themselves and win. Izuku nodded his head. Well, they'd been looking up hero videos, they'd seen a lot more than just what they'd been searching for. They'd seen villains with super strength and speed bested by heroes who didn't have the same level of power, proof that skill still played a part in such battles. Eli kept silent when Izuku had mentioned it. Skill did give you an advantage, but when the gap between two people was big enough, skill didn't make a difference. When she'd seen a video of All Might, the modern messiah, if the way everyone treated him meant anything, she doubted someone with even the speed and strength of a professional athlete would be able to stop him. Not unless he had some secret weakness, of course. Anyway, with Izuku's confidence now restored, the two began to discuss a workout plan for the boy. First on the list was a short jog after school every weekday. The local park should suffice for a location there, and on holidays they might replace that with a swim in the sea. Cycle routes were researched, and the two of them would attempt to follow one the coming Saturday, but Eli insisted he keep his Sundays free. She said that doing too much would break him rather than improve him. After a quick internet search, he reluctantly agreed. He wanted to get better now. He wanted to be a hero, what kid didn't? Every other kid had had their quirk for 4 years now. He needed to push himself super hard if he wanted to have even a chance of keeping up. Before they went any further, Inko called Izuku for supper, and the two shelved the discussion for now. Inko was a warrior by nature, made even worse by her son's desire to be a hero, and further compounded by his lack of any sort of quirk. Well, he was proven to have a quirk now, she'd never stop worrying. Even if he had some sort of complete invulnerability quirk, she'd still worry for him because she was his mother, and that's what she did. Now Izuku was asking if he could attend martial art classes and had printed off pamphlets for the half a dozen near enough for him to get to. This was a big thing for her. If she did this, she'd be accepting just what it was that Izuku wanted to do. She knew her son wanted to be a hero, and she wanted to support Izuku in whatever he chose to do, but it was still nerve-wracking. She pulled a pad of paper towards herself and began to compare the different martial arts. Izuku had gotten a lot of his habits from her, and this was just one of them to see which ones might be best. She almost struck Krav Maga off the list straight away. It had a rather well-known reputation for brutality after all, but she hesitated. Krav Maga was supposed to be very effective, and a quick search told her it was made to be rapidly teachable to military conscripts. Well, Izuku wasn't a violent person and might have trouble with the aggressive parts of the martial art. He picked things up quickly, and she would love to see him get results back from training quickly. He was actually out right now, jogging, though she didn't think he'd get very far before having to slow down. He'd get better though, Izuku was stubborn like that, but his improvement might be hard to measure. Back to martial arts. Krav Maga, aside from its brutal philosophy, sounded about right, but she didn't want to put all her eggs in one basket. Taking a look at the next leaflet, she found it to wax on about all the great things about kickboxing. This one she actually discarded right away. Well, kickboxing may well be a wonderful martial art. This particular dojo apparently focused on it as a sport, and she wanted her son to learn martial arts for self-defense. Perhaps karate was a better choice. She reached for her laptop, a small smile on her face as she did so. She still worried for her son though. Eli hadn't thought that Izuku would get far on his jog, and she wasn't all that impressed when he dropped, gasping for breath at her feet. Unimpressive, but not unexpected, given he wasn't exactly the fittest child ever. She handed a water bottle to him, which he drank from, stopping himself from simply chugging it. He took deep breaths, slowing his breathing, getting himself back under control before he got back to his feet and continued jogging. No, he wasn't the fittest boy ever, but he was bloody determined and stubborn. Mecha Eli-chan had a small smile on her face as she kept count of the laps Izuku was doing around the park. It seemed that Izuku just needed someone to get him started, and he would go from there himself. As Izuku went to sleep that night, Eli sat on the floor with her master's laptop on her knees. She'd have sat in a chair, but none of them were strong enough to support her weight. She began to research every servant that she was aware of. That was only a bare few dozen, less than 50 all told, and she hadn't even known them that well. However, on the chance that Izuku would summon another servant in the future, she thought he needed to know just how different they could be from how they had been portrayed historically. Potentially, she herself might be enough, being based on Elizabeth Bathory, but being a robot rather than the woman herself might complicate issues. Not that she wasn't pleased that they saw her as someone else entirely, which she was, just wary about who else could be summoned. The way Izuku had talked about heroes and villains had been strange to her, it seemed they'd overtake everything in the modern world. There were idol heroes, but not so many idols any longer, there was music still, but a significant portion were entertainment heroes. The police and fire service were reduced, partially replaced with combat and investigation heroes for the former, rescue heroes for the latter. She supposed this might be a natural progression of things, it did make sense in a way. With quirks in the mix, traditional methods of crime prevention simply wouldn't work or they wouldn't be as effective, resulting in enhanced law enforcement becoming a thing. Given how fast quirks had spread, governments would have had to change equally quickly, and things like that tend to scare the public. There's always some idiot claiming the world's gone the way of 1984 or similar stories, and having enhanced law enforcement has always been an element of stories in a dystopian future setting. This would mean that propaganda and positive advertising was needed. Hero is a word with a very positive spin on it, and adding in colorful costumes and friendly or at least ones that seem that way personalities would put people at ease. For all she knew, the ones in charge at the dawn of quirks had actually taken notes and ideas from comic books and manga. The way the world functioned now basically meant they were living in just such a world. She frowned at that. In the entire history of quirks, there had been ones that could do almost anything. From giving humans the features and abilities of creatures to physical enhancement, flight, and manipulation of various energies, but what had her most confused was the mechanical quirks that had occurred in the last century. She could understand, to an extent, how a technopath quirk revolving around code could work. Code was just a language after all as far as she was aware at least, and telepathy was already a thing that existed, so combining the two together made sense. However, what sort of naturally occurring biology would give someone engines in their arms, like ingenium? Engines that ran off grape juice at that. That implied there was more going on with quirks than natural evolution, but what was it? Was there some sort of entity watching the world and playing with humans in some sort of sandbox? This also tied into her own summoning to this world. She knew how masters and servants worked, she knew about magecraft, even if she didn't actually know any herself, and she knew how it functioned. So why was a quirk mimicking a completely different system? As far as she could tell, Izuku didn't have a single magic circuit in him, and he definitely didn't have the knowledge needed to craft command seals or a summoning circle, and she definitely didn't sense any sort of grail or similar presence supporting her. By all of her knowledge, she shouldn't be able to exist in this world, yet she did. Izuku shouldn't be able to support her mana requirements, and yet he apparently did, with a seriously low energy requirement at that. A slight drop in stamina for a young and not physically active child in return for all of her deadly capabilities. Granted, she'd not gone all out and had in fact not used her noble phantasm what she had of one, hers was basically just going into overdrive and unleashing every single weapon system she had on a single target, but that was still nothing to scoff at. It made her want to scream at how much sense it lacked. Even researching quirk biology didn't help. Scientists had managed to pinpoint the genetic markers that determined if one had a quirk or not, and had even made a lot of progress in matching particular ones to different types of quirks, but there was no real explanation on how that worked. There were pages and pages explaining how genetics paired up with quirks, how the quirks of the parents influenced what possibilities their child could have, excluding random mutations which existed, and kinda screwed those theories over, and even links between psychology and quirks. What none of them she found could tell her was how it all worked. When calculating the energy requirements that some quirks should need and the amount of energy a human body took in, it just didn't match up. A quick search told her that, except for particularly unusual cases, almost every human's dietary requirements were the same as they were in the pre-quirk era. That didn't go into the exact physics of them either. All Might, for example, could punch hard enough to literally change the weather. That didn't make sense, as the force necessary to disperse clouds high in the sky would easily damage structures much closer to him, yet he could unleash that sort of thing and have it simply ruffle someone's clothes when they were standing a dozen feet or so away from him. If All Might were a servant, that would make sense. Servants operated under the rules of mystery, not physics, and was one of the reasons a servant with even a moderate rank in agility could run up walls and even across ceilings in some cases. All Might, however, was human, or assumed to be at least. That made Eli consider whether his quirk actually was super strength, as most people online seemed to believe, or whether it was some sort of energy or force amplifier that he primarily used for strength. If the latter was the case, and he amplified a force over a much larger area, then shifting clouds might be more plausible. It was still an insane level of strength however, and servant or not, Eli would not want to be hit with something like that. Actually, a spirit made physical or not, it was still possible to damage her without resorting to magic, it just required an inordinate amount of power to do so. At this point, Eli was glad she wasn't organic. The level of headache she would be getting from this would be debilitating, and she wasn't finished yet. Next, she wanted to do some research on animals with quirks. Nezu was the most high profile she had found, and even he was relatively unknown. She had to dig deep to find more, and she wasn't sure whether she was surprised or not that most of the animals she found turned out to be villains. She even began to wonder if high spec was really all there was to Nexus quirk. All animals that had quirks of their own showed heightened intelligence, a lot of them even being able to understand languages and speak them in turn. Perhaps Nezu was simply a particularly intelligent example of one. But if that was the case, what actually was his quirk? She was a servant. She didn't need sleep. She needed answers. The next morning, Izuku gave Eli some weird looks. She'd filled almost a full notebook with notes and she was acting jittery. That was the best word for it he had. She was acting like Izuku had that one time his dad had been home and Izuku had gotten curious and chugged his coffee. She was also making Izuku's own head hurt with her questions. Izuku had thought he had been a quirk nerd, but he hadn't ever thought about exactly how quirks actually worked, and now he really wanted to know too. Inko had been rather bemused when Izuku almost completely abandoned his breakfast to debate the possibility of aliens being responsible for quirks, using humans for experiments or some such nonsense. This wasn't helped by Eli admitting she knew aliens actually existed, though she didn't know very much about them herself. That had sent the two off into a tangent about what she did know and whether there was some way of proving they were responsible for quirks appearing. Inko, feeling oddly cheerful and mischievous herself, decided to play devil's advocate and tossed in some weird and wonderful theories to the mix as well. Everything from time travelers, magic, and ancient curses to extra-dimensional gods. The fact that Eli had an answer, even if in a vague way, for each of them made Inko laugh. Seeing the gleam in her son's eyes that had been missing for 4 years was worth any amount of hardship. She'd even started looking into moving just the day before. Eli was avoiding the middle of the room, staying near the walls where the floor was strongest and stepping carefully, but her weight was still putting a lot of stress on the floor. If they lived in a poor neighborhood where the buildings weren't built as solidly, or even worse, a pre-quirk house from before building regulations had been updated, then she'd have probably collapsed through the floor when she was going up the stairs. Even so, she was still straining the limit of what the building could handle. 4 tons was a lot of weight, more than 60 times as heavy as a normal person. Still, Eli was being careful, and she hadn't fallen through the floor yet, so while it was a concern it wasn't one that needed addressing right this second. What she did need to do was get Izuku to eat his breakfast and head out the door before he was late for school. With some well-chosen words and a new theory thrown into their discussion for good measure, she got Izuku fed and out the door with his school bag. She drained the last of her coffee and set off herself, heading to another day of work. As she got into her car, she looked at the apartment and thought about whether she would miss it if they moved. Truthfully, not really, the people in a home were more important than any apartment would ever be. Izuku had a rather good day at school once again. The teachers were keeping an eye out for anyone targeting him, and everyone was still confused as to why they were doing so. There had been no announcement about him getting a quirk at last, and there wouldn't be, now he was just another normal student. Izuku thought about having his lunch in the cafeteria today, rather than hiding away like he usually did, but decided to keep doing so. He wanted to continue talking with Eli about all the things she'd been researching through the night, and he didn't want to cause a fuss, which is what would happen if other people saw Eli. Izuku could be a rather shy person at times. Yes, he wanted to be a hero, and yes, he chased down hero sightings to see them at work, but he was also easily embarrassed and didn't yet have much self-confidence either. He'd stood up to bullies, like Kakin, but he'd become a punching bag in place of whoever they had been targeting at the time. He frowned. He'd never thought of Kakin as a bully before. Where had that come from? Was it because Eli didn't like him? She'd said, after she'd seen Kakin, that she didn't like him and she didn't seem happy when, as he'd been jogging, he'd said he needed to do better to get anywhere near where Kakin was at. Izuku wasn't stupid, he knew Kakin did some things wrong. Hadn't he told the blonde that heroes shouldn't use their quirk to hurt people when he'd gotten in the way? Hadn't he said before that heroes shouldn't talk like that when Kakin called everyone else losers or extras? But Izuku remembered what Kakin had been like when they were 4 years old and earlier. They were absolutely best friends forever. They did everything together, went everywhere together, always played together, watched All Might videos together. They were best friends, weren't they? Kakin even had a super amazing quirk. His parents didn't really have strong combat quirks, Auntie Mitsuki had a quirk that gave her really smooth skin, and Uncle Masaru's quirk was also a sweaty one that let him rub his hands together to make little popping explosions, like cracklers. It was amazing how those two quirks combined into such a powerful one like Kaken's explosions. It even made sense to a degree, all three of them had sweat quirks, and glycerin was already acidic, and nitroglycerin was even more so. Okay, so Kaken's quirk wasn't exactly nitroglycerin, and Izuku theorized that Katsuki's quirk actually mixed glycerin with potassium permanganate. Either way, water diluted it down and made it a lot weaker. Izuku remembered when Kaken fell into a stream once, and the explosions after were smaller and weaker when he got out, and he wasn't fully soaked at the time, just a bit wet. While he was theorizing about Katsuki's quirk, having mentally and unintentionally distracted himself from thinking about whether Katsuki was his friend or not, the school day had finished, and he took a moment to pack everything away in his bag and start heading home. Once again, however, Katsuki Bakugo got in the way. "Where is she, Deku?" he asked, almost politely for him. "What Kachin? Where's who?" Izuku took a moment to realize he was there. "Robo bitch, who else?" Katsuki said. "I wanna fight her." "Why?" Izuku asked, brow furrowed. "She took one of my explosions, fucking idiot." The blonde spat, as if it was obvious. "Let's see how big of one she can take before she's in pieces, eh? Kaken? No." Izuku shook his head. "We shouldn't fight, that would be wrong." "I don't want to fight you, fucking Deku." Katsuki laughed. "What the fuck can you even do yourself? I want to fight her. If I can't break a stupid robot, how will I ever be number one?" "Kaken, just." Izuku tried to calm him down. An explosion was the response. Katsuki had had enough of his stalling. The blonde grinned widely when he saw, once again, a metal wing block his explosion and protect Izuku. Once the smoke dissipated, the form of Mecha Eli-chan was revealed once more, glaring at the boy who sought to harm her master. "So that's how it works, huh?" Katsuki's smile showed all his teeth. "She'll only appear if you're going to be hurt. That works for me." His eyes glimmered maliciously at that, before he used an explosion to launch himself at the servant. He wasn't fast enough, however, as Eli knocked him out of the air. He wouldn't let that stop him though, and used his explosions to launch himself at her again, the recoil and sudden change in direction doing nothing good for his wrists, arms, and shoulders. Seeing him coming again, Eli grabbed the aggressive child and pinned him to the ground with one foot. He struggled, but she was simply too heavy for him to shift off of himself, not that she was actually putting any weight onto his back. "Most definitely a berserker, this one." Eli frowned. "One of the servant classes, mine is alter ego." Berserkers are characterized by mad enhancement, a skill which trades sanity for power. Some of them retain their intelligence, but even the best of them are crazy in some way. Eli explained. "Can you call his parents or something to come and get him?" "Oh, I have Auntie Mitsuki's number, yes," Izuku said, before pulling out his phone. After a short conversation with the exasperated woman, Izuku and Eli had a conversation about the different classes of servant, attempting to ignore the angry boy beneath the ladder's foot, who missed the entire thing in his attempts at attacking the machine keeping him pinned down. He only realized what was going on when he heard his hag of the mother's obnoxious laughter and the sound of her phone camera going off as she took a picture of his situation. He burned with both shame and rage for that. Deku would pay for embarrassing him. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.